China invented gunpowder first. How did they not take over the world? Europe didn't start playing with gunpowder until the 1300s, but China had it since, I don't know, the 9th century, around like 810, 820 AD. And it's not like the Chinese just used it for like fireworks and celebratory stuff. They absolutely used it in warfare. They had fire arrows, makeshift rockets, they had cannons. And by the 10th century, the Chinese were mounting these cannons on ships and they were having naval battles using gunpowder. Yet this was the extent of their empire during the Tang Dynasty, which ended around the year 970. So the Chinese had access to this revolutionary technology in warfare for over 3 centuries. I mean, look at this hand cannon. Look how many hundreds of thousands of troops could have been armed to, again, take over all of Asia. And I know the idealists will say, oh, that's just Western thinking. Not everything has to be conquered. No. China cared more about stability, and if they could conquer territory and stay stable, they would take that gamble. But you know who was willing to make that gamble and adapt to the technology that the Chinese had very quickly? Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire, which swept over most of Asia like a wildfire. They conquered all across Asia, into Russia, and they completely destroyed the Middle East. And as the Mongol hordes ravaged all of Eurasia, word got to Europe about this new weaponry. So of course the Italians took a great deal of interest in what this gunpowder and black stuff was. The first recorded incident of Europe using gunpowder as a form of artillery in cannons was in Florence, and these cannons were called bombards, which makes sense. Now, these bombards had a great psychological impact, and anything that they managed to hit with a cannon definitely got destroyed, but the Florentines weren't able to make too many of these guys. The iron used to make the cannons was also very hard to wield, and it would, of course, rust. Within 5 years in northern Italy, they became much more popular, and in another 10 years, the British were already mounting these cannons onto their ships for naval skirmishes. By the mid-1300s, the beginning of the 100 Years' War between England and France broke out, and at the Battle of Crécy, the English were already using fields of these cannons. Not bombards, but their own smaller versions. By the 1400s, these cannons were so powerful that castles that were once considered to be impregnable would be down within hours after a few barrages of these dangerous weapons of destruction. It was because of the advances in artillery that Constantinople fell in 1453 after the Hungarian engineer Orban betrayed all of Western civilization and sold these cannons to the Sultan, who destroyed the last bastion of the Roman Empire. Remember those Chinese hand cannons I mentioned? This was the most primitive form of the rifle that we could see. They had no trigger mechanism. They had to be lit and fired like a cannon. Well, guess what happened? At the beginning of the 15th century, the Chinese hand cannon was improved and turned into the arquebus, which could be easily mounted on the shoulder and fired with a triggering mechanism instead of firing it and lighting it like a cannon. These weapons required little to no training compared to their equivalent, which was the longbow or the shortbow, which took years to master. And that's it. Warfare changed completely. Now there were these large lines and companies of artillery and even larger formations of men wielding these, I don't know, thunder sticks of death, while any other army that had, bows, arrows, spears would just be completely obliterated. Europe managed to do that after just getting like a few whiffs of the Chinese technology, which the Chinese have had for at least 5 centuries before. And the crazy thing is, China most likely at the time, even by the 13 or 1400s, had a more advanced culture than most of the European ones. Yet China is the one that fell into heavy decline and ended up getting exploited by the West. My theory is because Europe was not only more warlike, but they were always fighting one another because they were not one unified bloc. There were always these small or large pieces of land fighting to take more land or try not to lose any more from the enemy that they already have. Let's go back to the 100 Years' War and one of the major battles of Agincourt, which was around 1415 AD, in which the English completely destroyed the French armies. And for well over a couple decades, the French were getting constantly humiliated by the British until, of course, Joan of Arc and then some reorganization of the French army happened, but most importantly, the adoption of cannons and artillery. And then by 1440, the French started destroying the British. Most notably, the Battle of Castillon in 1440, when the British were finally routed from all of France except for one little piece of Calais. After that point, for well over 100 years, everybody was terrified of French artillery. Then, of course, every major European power started developing their own artillery, their own arquebuses, their own forms of firepower to compete with the French. And the cycle went on and on. More war happened between European countries in the 14, 15, and 1600s, but even while they were fighting each other, they were conquering North and South America, and of course, a bunch of Africa and Southern Asia. And eventually, even China, the inventor of gunpowder, of paper, of all of these brilliant and novel things, ended up being completely harassed, bullied, and subjugated by the West until 1949. And my theory about why China, this formerly advanced culture, became so easily subjugated by the West is because of potentially the limitations of Confucianism, of Taoism, of just seeking no change, or little change at the very least. While China was very unwilling to accept anything that the West had to offer, the West was willing to look anywhere from anybody in order to conquer their neighbors and further enemies. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing at all, but it is what allowed the West to conquer the known world. And it's almost a lesson. Choosing to be isolationist and just go with the status quo puts you at the mercy of those who won't. I am the Geo Husar, and I said what I said about Orobon the engineer. Thanks for watching.